My name is Robert Lawson. I'm the director of the Bridwell Institute for Economic Freedom. And one of the things that Rick always tells me I forget to do at these events is say something about the Bridwell Institute. But this week it's easy, or this time it's easy because we have these new annual reports that just were released today, basically. These are hot off the presses. And so take a look at those. There's some around the room. If you don't have one right where you are, there's going to be one a row or two away. The annual report features two essays, one by one of our professors, Ryan Murphy, who is over here. A nice essay on the size of government. How big is the government in the United States? It turns out it's small relative to most countries, and it's really small if you compare the United States to other rich countries. And then the other essay is by Dean Stanzel. Dean's not here tonight because we're running a reading group for 12 undergraduate SMU students over in the tower, Expressway Tower across the highway. And tonight's Tuesday night, so he's got the reading group tonight. And they don't get to skip a reading group to come to our events. So they're out there reading, I don't know who they're reading tonight, Karl Marx or something, or Adam Smith, or I don't know, somewhere in the middle of those two extremes. So, but the other essay is by Dean, and it's about his Metropolitan Area Economic Freedom Index. The Bridwell Institute, if it's anything, we're an Economic Freedom Index shop. I work on the Economic Freedom of the World. Dean Stanzel also works on the Economic Freedom of North America. And then in this report, we have the latest edition of his Metropolitan Area Economic Freedom Index. And so those are the featured essays. After those essays, there's all the usual annual report stuff, all the things we did last year, all of last year's speakers, the events, the programs. And I invite you to take a look at that. All right. So with no further ado, let me introduce our speaker. I'm really excited to have Steve Landsburg. Steve is a hero of mine. I think the armchair economist, I was going to ask Steve to sign it, but I know what happened. It's gone because I gave it to someone and it didn't come back to me because it's one of those books that I've probably purchased 5 or 6 copies of, and each time I hand it to somebody because I was like, you need to read this, it doesn't come back. Steve's also an inspiration because he's written a number of trade press, popular audience books that are really exceptional. I mentioned The Armchair Economist. There's also a book called Fair Play. Everyone's favorite, More Sex is Safer Sex, and and then a book called The Big Questions. And some of you know Ben Powell and I wrote a popular trade press book about socialism, and Steve was extraordinarily kind to write a blurb for us, and that meant a lot to both Ben and me that Steve was willing to do that for us. I won't give a much longer introduction. Steve's a professor of economics at the University of Rochester, an excellent teacher, as you'll see very soon. He was recently elected to, the Professor of the Year, which is an elected by the students at the University of Rochester. So, and that's an award I know I will never win. All right. So with no further ado, Steve, take it away.
Come out to my suburban neighborhood next Saturday morning, and this is what you will see. On every lawn, a man with a leaf blower blowing his leaves onto the next man's lawn. They all work for about 3 hours or so, and then they go back inside, and they might as well have spent that time watching football. That's a minor tragedy. Here's another one. Something exciting happens at the ballpark, everybody stands up to see better, and therefore nobody sees any better. You might think that the problem here has something to do with some kind of mass irrationality. But if you thought that, you would be wrong. There's no irrationality here at all. It's perfectly rational to blow leaves off your lawn. It's perfectly rational to stand up to see better. The problem is not irrationality, the problem is selfishness. The problem is that when people do not care about the way their actions affect other people, we tend to get terrible outcomes. There is, though, one great and glorious exception to that rule. And that is that when we intersect through the price system, we have the information and the incentives that lead us to act as if we cared about everybody. That's what led the great economist Adam Smith to say very famously that it's not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from the regard to their own interest. The point is that the baker really doesn't care whether you eat or starve, but prices give him a reason to act as if he cares. And that's why he puts bread on your table. even if he did care, even if he was a born altruist who just wanted to help people, he still wouldn't be able to do his job without prices, because he would not know what kind of bread you like. He would not know whether your pantry is full or empty. He would not know who on your block needs their bread today and who doesn't want it till tomorrow. He needs prices to get all that information. So prices are conveying both information and incentives, and they do it in a way that leads to outcomes that are very, very good. In fact, the baker acts as if he cares not just about putting food on your table, but also conserving resources for other people all over the world. If a bunch of people halfway around the world, for some reason, decide that they want to eat more wheat, the price of wheat goes up, the price of wheat flour goes up, and our baker has an incentive to think about switching to recipes that use buckwheat flour or rice flour instead of wheat flour. Now, most bakers won't make that switch, but some will. The ones who were already thinking about maybe switching, they had some interest from their customers in buckwheat muffins or something, they are going to notice that price increase, make the switch, and leave more wheat for those people halfway around the world who want more wheat, as if he cared about them, which I absolutely assure you he does not, because he doesn't even know they exist. He doesn't know somebody in the world wants more wheat. All he knows is that a price went up, and that's all he needs to know. It's even better than that. In a very precise sense, in a sense we can make very precise, the bakers of the world collectively produce exactly the right amount of bread, the perfect median that balances the interests of the people they are baking for and the people they are conserving resources for. Neither too much bread nor too little. Now, it would take some words to say exactly what I mean by the right amount. One does that in an economics class. And when I say that with prices we get the exact right amounts of everything, that's not an ideological statement. That's not a statement of blind optimism. That's a mathematical fact that routinely gets proved on blackboards in advanced economics classes. But unfortunately, a lot of our interactions don't involve prices. And therefore, there are a lot of things that the world has either too much of or too little. And what I want to talk about tonight is how to tell the difference, how to tell when we have too much of something, when we have too little of something. The answer is not always obvious. Take pollution, for example. The right amount of pollution is not zero. A world with zero pollution would have no tall buildings, no air conditioning. Imagine living in Dallas with no air conditioning. No way for me to get down here and give a talk to you. We'd all be eating much poorer. Our lives in every way you can imagine would be poorer if we tried to have a world with no pollution. So the right amount of pollution is not zero. There is some right amount, some positive right amount. And once you've noticed that, then that kind of forces you to ask the question, well, the amount we've got right now, is it too much or too little? Given that there is a right amount that's more than zero, the answer to that's not completely obvious. But I think I know the answer. I'm pretty sure the world has too much pollution. And the reason for that is that, by and large, the people who create pollution have no incentive to think about the damage that it's causing to other people. When people engage in activities that impose costs on other people, which they don't feel themselves, those are the things we tend to get too much of. And when people engage in activities that confer benefits on other people, that they don't get rewarded for, that the decision maker doesn't get rewarded for, we get too little of those activities, which is why there are too few people out in the park picking up litter. The way to know whether we have too much or too little of something is to look at the incentives that were faced by the decision makers. Did they feel all the costs of their actions, or did some of those costs spill over onto other people? Did they feel all the benefits of their actions? Did some of those benefits spill over onto other people? Let's let me apply that, the pollution example went by pretty quick. Let me apply that to a more extended example and ask, does the world have too many people or too few? Is the world underpopulated or overpopulated? Now, whenever I ask that question, there's usually somebody in the audience who says or wants to say, oh, come on, there's obviously a limit to the number of people the Earth can support. That's the person who is simply refusing to think about the subject, because we all know that there's a limit to the number of people the Earth can support. We all know there's such a thing as too many people. That's all you're saying when you say that, is that there's such a thing as too many people. That's true. There's also such a thing as too few people. That does not do anything to settle the question of whether the number we currently have is too many or too few. To answer that question, you need to look at the incentives faced by the relevant decision makers. And when it comes to population, the relevant decision makers are the parents and the prospective parents who are choosing their family sizes. If we want to know whether the world has too many or too few people, you've got to look at the decisions they're making, the way those decisions affect other people, and whether they are incentivized to care about those things. So, let me imagine a family deciding whether to have a child or not. And let's try and list some of the most obvious benefits and some of the most obvious costs. But just listing benefits and costs is not going to help us, because the benefits and costs that they feel themselves are irrelevant to the question of whether the world has too many children. People, I have the right number of socks. Not too many or too few, because I decide how many socks to buy and it doesn't affect anybody else. Okay? And parents have the right number of children insofar as it affects the parents. The costs and benefits that the parents feel then are not relevant to the question. That leads to the right number of children. But then there are also benefits and costs that spill onto other people, and those are the ones that are going to be relevant to the too much, too little question. So I'm going to divide this box up once more between what I'll call the private costs felt by the parents and the spillover costs. Those spillover costs are exactly what an economist would call external costs, but I think, especially for a talk like this, the word spillover is a little more, it's a better word. It's more indicative of exactly what's going on. So let me try filling in the boxes here. I'll start with the easy ones. I'll start on the private side. What are some of the private benefits of having a child? Well, if you've had a child, you probably know that love is a big one. We love our children. They love us. We like the fact that they love us. Not always, but most of the time. And we usually expect it when we decide to have a child, at least. Help on the farm in some instances, or help in the family business, or engagement in the family economic enterprise. Old age care. A lot of people look for their kids to help take care of them when they get old. So those are some of the private benefits of having a child. What about the costs, the private costs, the costs the parents feel? Well, if you got a kid, you got to feed the kid. If you've got a kid, you've got to clothe the kid. You stay up late nights with the child when the child is sick or unhappy or has had an emotional trauma or something. That's a big cost. A little later on, they get a little older, you're bailing them out of jail. So those are the benefits and costs the parents feel. Those, again, are the benefits and costs that are not going to be relevant to our question. The relevant question is the spillover stuff. So let me start with the spillover benefits, and I want to try and give an honest accounting of both benefits and costs. I'll start with the spillover benefits. Trading partners. The child that you have is a trading partner for a lot of other people. Your children are going to be employees, they're going to be employers, they're going to be customers, they're going to be suppliers, and lots of other people are going to benefit from that. And when you were deciding how many children to have, you probably didn't think about all those other people who were going to benefit from being able to trade with your child. Friendship. Your kid is going to go through life and have a lot of friends, and those friends are going to be really glad they know your kid. And that's something you probably didn't think about when you were deciding whether to have another child. Love. You might think that in a world with 7 billion people, it's not too hard to find love. If that were true, Match.com would not be making $2 billion a year. So each additional child is somebody that probably somebody is going to find love with. And that's, again, something that benefits someone other than the parents. Then there's diversity. Just bringing more people into the world creates more diversity and makes it possible for the world to have more activities. If you like chamber music, if you like parasailing, if you like Ethiopian restaurants, if you like talks like this one, then you got to be glad that a lot of other people had children that like the same things, otherwise they wouldn't exist. So diversity is on my list here. And the next one, I'm going to put it in a bigger font because it's, I believe, the most important, ideas. Every idea your child has as he or she goes through life is an idea that other people can copy. I'm talking about ideas ranging from, hey, let's put on a show, to, hey, I wonder if we could make computer chips out of silicon. Okay. Every idea your child has is going to benefit a lot of people. And again, you didn't think about that when you were deciding whether to have another kid or not. This is Ted Baxter. I don't know how many people recognize him anymore. He was the buffoonish anchorman on the old Mary Tyler Moore show. And he was always being made a joke of because of his silly ideas. There was an episode where Ted said that he was planning to have 12 children because he was hoping that one of them would grow up to figure out how to solve the world's population problem. Ted was a lousy anchorman, but he was a great economist because he was absolutely right. Progress comes from ideas, and ideas comes from people, and the more people we have, the more ideas and the more progress we have. A bigger population leads to more ideas. Ideas lead to more prosperity. Prosperity means that people can afford to have more kids, and so prosperity leads to more people. And this sort of virtuous circle we see over and over again through the last million years of human history. The Nobel Prize-winning economist Michael Kramer has a paper where he has looked at 1,000,000 years of human history and found that these cycles sometimes break, something happens that prevents us from continuing around and around the circle, but that a large part of the history of human progress is what you're looking at right there on that screen. The more people, the more ideas. On the left, we have a world of 10 people with 2 geniuses. The geniuses are in red. Here we have a world of 20 people with 4 geniuses. Twice as many people have twice as many, means twice as many geniuses. So the society with more people is more successful for exactly the same reason that the high school, the bigger high school, has the better football team. But it's better than that. It's better than that. Because ideas last forever and geniuses inspire each other. They inspire their contemporary geniuses and they inspire future geniuses. So here we have 2 geniuses inspiring each other. Here we have 4 geniuses inspire each other. That's a lot more inspiration going around. And so it makes each one of them even more productive. And those ideas last forever, so it makes the geniuses of the next generation more productive, and the next generation, and the next. I have to pause there and say there is a countervailing force, which is that geniuses inspire each other. They can also intimidate each other. And it is also true that if I am a genius surrounded by geniuses, I might say, well, those guys are going to have all the good ideas, so why should I bother? So geniuses, it's not perfect, okay? It's not perfect, but to a large extent, they inspire each other, they make each other more productive. And a larger market, more people in the market, inspires not just the geniuses, but all of us to make more effort to come up with good inventions. I am more likely to try to come up with a good invention if there are more people I can sell it to. And so the big population, the twice of the population is a lot more than twice as good in a lot of ways. Let me give you a sort of digress into a brief history of the human race. Modern humans emerged about 100,000 years ago. And then for the next 99,800 years, nothing happened. Nothing happened. Oh, there were some wars, there was some political intrigue, there was the invention of agriculture, none of it mattered. None of it mattered in the sense that up until a couple hundred years ago, virtually everyone who ever lived right at the subsistence level on the modern equivalent of maybe $600 or $700 a year. There were times and places where it was better, times and places where it was maybe even twice that. That's about where it caps off. And of course, there were always these tiny, tiny, tiny nobilities and royalties that lived far better, but they were numerically insignificant, so that if you were born any time before about 200 years ago, the odds are overwhelming that you would have lived on the modern equivalent of $700, $800, if you were extremely fortunate, $1,200 a year, just like your parents, just like your grandparents, just like your children, just like your grandchildren. And then around the year 1800, something happened. Well, okay, so that's my picture of what was supposed to be up while I was saying that other stuff. There's your timeline with nothing happening, and the little red part at the end is when people suddenly started to rise above that subsistence level. Around the year 1800, for the first time in human history, incomes started to rise. It started mostly in England, and incomes started to rise at a rate of about 0.5% a year. A decade later, it was happening around the world. By 1830, incomes were rising at about 1.5% a year. And since about 1950, I say 2.3% there. The last few years have not been good, and we've had COVID, and before that we had a financial crisis. But mostly since 1950 in the United States, we have maintained growth rates of about 2.3% a year. 2.3% a year. What does that mean? How do I translate that into what it means for how people live their lives? Start with the assumption that you have a pretty moderate middle-class income of $50,000 a year. That's toward the low end of the middle class in the United States for a household, $50,000 a year. Suppose that 2.3% growth rate that we have mostly had since 1950 persists. Then in 25 years, your children will be earning the inflation-adjusted equivalent of $89,000 a year. That's $89,000 in today's dollars. So those are not some future inflation-ravaged dollars. That's the equivalent of $89,000 in today's dollars. Another 25 years, and your grandchildren will be earning $158,000 a year, more than 3 times as much as you. From $50,000 to $89,000 to $158,000 in 2 generations. That's the power of economic growth. And if that 2.3% growth rate were to continue, then in about 350 years, your descendants, assuming they occupy that same modest place in the middle class that you do, will be earning $1 million per day unless they rise above mediocrity and live even better. If you find that implausible, ask yourself what would have happened if I had stood here 350 years ago and tried to tell people what life was going to be like today. Okay? That would have been more unbelievable to them, I guarantee you, than this is to you. I don't know if we're going to maintain that growth rate. I do know that in some sense this is a pretty conservative estimate, because it assumes we're going to continue with that 2.3% growth rate that we've had since 1950, whereas in fact, growth rates have gone from 0.5 to 1.5 to 2.3. They've mostly continued to increase. So that's a conservative estimate. Where could all that wealth possibly come from? Oh, well, before I get to that, here's a picture of economic growth in the United States. This again is in inflation-adjusted dollars. This is all in 2015 dollars. This is the income of the average American household, and you can see on the graph there, I hope, how dramatic that growth is. There are some little blips downward. At the very, very top there, you see a blip in 2020, and we all know what caused that. And a little before that, you see a bigger blip downward, which is related to the financial crisis. And over here, in the 1930s, we have a blip downward, which is called the Great Depression. The Great Depression. Here is what happened in the Great Depression. Incomes fell back to where they had been 25 years earlier. Incomes fell back to where they had been 25 years earlier. People had to live the way that their parents had taken for granted, and they found it intolerable. They found it intolerable to live the way that their parents thought was normal, because they had internalized the idea that things are supposed to get better and better every year. But that is a brand new thing in human history. Up until about the year 1800, nobody thought that things were ever going to get better. No 18th century politician ever asked, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? Because nobody in the 18th century ever expected to be better off than they were 4 years ago. So if we're going to get all this wealth, and all this wealth we've accumulated, where does it come from? Partly it comes from investment. Each generation, instead of consuming all their income, they invest some of it. And that makes it possible to build factories and to build machines, which create opportunities for future generations to be more productive and earn higher incomes. And then they put some of that aside, which creates more factories and more machines, which makes the generation even more productive. So partly it comes from investment, but that cannot be the whole story. And the reason it cannot be the whole story is that the more machines you have, the more you have to spend maintaining those machines. So we build machines, we pass them on to the next generation. They got all these great machines. They also got to spend a lot of money maintaining them. And they managed to save something so they can build more machines for the next generation, but that generation now has to maintain even more machines. And if you work out the consequences of that, you discover that if you're relying on investment for your economic growth, it eventually peters out. The economy eventually levels off. You're spending so much maintaining the existing machines, you don't have anything left over to build new ones. So investment is great for a while, and then it stops working. Where then does all the wealth come from? There's only one other candidate. It's got to come from ideas. And when I say that progress comes from ideas, everybody thinks of things like computers and electronics and fancy cars. But when I say ideas, I mean something more general than that. I mean the farmer who comes up with a new system of crop rotation, or the business person who comes up with a new method of inventory management. You can fly from Dallas to Tokyo partly because somebody figured out how to build an airplane, and partly because somebody else figured out how to insure it. You have a computer on your desk because somebody said, I wonder if we can build computer chips out of silicon. But also partly because somebody else said, I wonder if we can fund startup companies with junk bonds. You needed both. You needed the merging of those two sets of ideas. And in the case of the computers, if you want to know which idea was more important, a very rough way to answer that is to follow the money. Back in the early 90s, at sort of the dawn of the computer revolution, Microsoft was making about $600 million a year in profit. So was Michael Milken, the junk bond king, making about $600 million a year in profit. So it looks there like their contributions are roughly equal. It's not just our incomes that have been going up. It's also our leisure time. In 1910, the work week was 65 hours on average. 2010, it was 33 hours. People working about half as much every week. In 1910, 6% of manufacturing workers had ever had a vacation. In 2010, it was 100%. Retirement. In 1910, 26% of 65-year-old men were retired. 65 years old in 1910 is really old. Okay? Life expectancies were not what they are now. Okay? Only 26 of them were retired. The rest were still working. By 2010, 90% of 65-year-olds were retired. Child labor, absolutely common in 1910, gone by 2010. And I might say, this is a little bit of a digression, child labor around the world, we're seeing it in country after country, disappears when people reach a certain level of income, and that level of income is remarkably constant. People in the 1830s, 1840s in the United States and England were taking their kids out of the labor force when their incomes reached a certain level. And in the third world today, we're seeing people take their kids out of the labor force when their incomes reach pretty much those exact same levels. So the rise in income and the fall in child labor, very closely related. Housework. In 1910, the average housekeeper spent 12 hours a day on cooking, laundry, cleaning, sewing. By 2010, it was 1.5 hours. Here is the typical housewife's work day, laundry day in the year 1900. It took her 8.5 hours to do one load of laundry, and she walked over a mile in the process. We know this because the United States government used to hire researchers to follow housewives around and count their every step as they did their work. Okay? So the average in 1900, 8.5 hours a mile, 8.5 hours heating the big tubs of water on the stove, carrying them across the room, washing the clothes, wringing them out with the mechanical, the hand wringer, and then the oppressive task of ironing using the giant flat irons that are heated continuously over a hot stove. 8.5 hours of that. By 1940, our heroine has a washing machine. It takes her 2.5 hours to do a load of laundry. She walks 665 feet in the process. And today, in 2022, my washing machine sends me a text message to let me know when it's done. So I don't have to do anything at all. That was laundry. Laundry is only one thing that this person was doing. Other routine household tasks included lugging 7 tons of coal and 9,000 gallons of water around the house every year. And this happens to be the 40 years that I have numbers for. Between 1965 and 2005, the average American gained 6 hours a week of leisure. The amount of time that people spent working went down by 6 hours a week. That's the equivalent of 7 extra vacation weeks per year for the average American. And it's not just income and leisure that have improved. Also, the quality of the goods we buy have improved. I was, until this morning, I was planning to put up a bunch of slides showing you pictures of the incredibly cruddy goods we were all buying 40 years ago to remind you of the quality of the radios and the cameras and the entertainment systems we had back then and the cars. I don't need to show those. All I need to do is send you out and tell you to go to the library, they have them, find yourself a 40, 50-year-old Sears catalog, look through it, you will be stunned, and you will not be able to find anything in that catalog you would be willing to buy, even at the prices from then, I guarantee it. Or, take something like medical care. We have a pretty screwed up medical system in this country, but despite that, here's how much medicine has advanced in the last 40 or 50 years. Look at medical care in the poorest parts of the third world today. The poorest parts of the third world. Measure it any way you want to, by life expectancy, infant mortality, any of the standard measures of medical quality. What they're getting is about exactly the same as what the average American had in 1975. That's how far we have come since 1975. That's how far we have come since 1975. That recently, we were getting the medical care that you would get today in the poorest parts of the third world. I should qualify that statement a little. Those numbers are corrected for the AIDS epidemic, which you could argue is a one-time thing. The AIDS numbers are not included in the numbers I counted. I think you could argue one way or another on whether that's a reasonable thing to do. The moral of all this is that even the gigantic income gains of the past couple centuries vastly overestimate how much our lives have improved. Henry VIII ruled all of England. I am willing to bet that he would have traded half of it for modern plumbing, a lifetime supply of antibiotics, and access to the internet. So all of that is by way of pointing out to you the importance of ideas in my spillover benefit box. They're so important, I'm going to put them in an even bigger font. Now, We got one more box to talk about. The spillover costs of having children. The first one most people think of is resource consumption. The food you eat, the fuel you burn, the land you occupy, that's all not available to other people. And that looks like a big cost that your parents imposed on other people when they decided to have you. Okay? So you might think that resource consumption goes into this spillover box. I'm not convinced that's true. It's certainly partly true, but I'm not convinced it's mostly true. Because when I think about where you get your resources, well, some of them you create yourself. You plant an apple tree that nobody else was going to plant. You're not taking that from anyone. Some of it you trade for. You take one of the apples off your tree, you trade it for a fish. Somebody willingly gives you the fish. That's not hurting anyone. But where do you get the wealth to get started on all this stuff? A lot of us get it from our families. We get it from our families in various forms. Our parents educate us. They teach us how to behave in the world. That's a big investment on their part. They pay for our education sometimes. And they leave inheritances, or they give gifts during lifetime. A lot, if you are the average American, a lot of your wealth came from your family. From your family. Who specifically did it come from? It came from your siblings, right? That's who would have gotten it if you hadn't. If you have an older brother, the day you were born was the worst day of that older brother's life. Okay? Because you took half the parental attention and half the inheritance and half the financial gifts during lifetime, all of that. But your parents thought you were worth it, even though they loved that older brother. When your parents decided to have you, assuming the older brother is there, the calculation is, man, this is really going to hurt the older one, but and we care about him. That's not a spillover because we care about it. It doesn't count as a spillover if the decision maker cares about it. But they said it's worth it to us for the love and other things that we think we're going to get from the second kid. So anything you got from your parents, if they cared about your siblings, does not count as a spillover. They accounted for it. They accounted for it. And so a lot of resource consumption goes in the private costs. Not all of it, but an awful lot of it. A lot of people get this wrong. People somehow imagine that if I didn't exist, there would be a little more stuff for everybody else. It's not true. If I didn't exist, there'd be nothing more for any of you, and there'd be a whole lot more for these two people, my sisters. But again, what I took from my sisters does not count as a spillover because the decision was made by my parents who cared about those sisters. So that brings me back here. I'm putting resource consumption provisionally in that private cost section. And now what other spillover costs could we think about? What about crowding? Okay. People say, oh God, the world's so crowded and that's a problem. That I don't like that. But the world's not crowded, okay? The world is mostly empty. The world is I know, it seems like there are a lot of people in the world. The fact is, you can fit them all in the Grand Canyon if you stack them right. Or take this calculation, which I stole from the economist Thomas Sowell. Take the state of Texas, divide it up into lots equal to the size of the average middle-class home lot in the United States. Divide the state of Texas up into lots equal to the size of the average middle-class home lot in the United States. On each of those lots, put a family of 4. You have just housed the entire world's population. Or if you don't want them here, we can fit them in France. And then you have Italy left over for all the McDonald's and Taco Bells. Crowding is not a cost because crowding is voluntary. If you are in a crowded place, it's because you chose to be in a crowded place. Most people are in crowded places. That's why they're crowded. Okay? Most people think that it's worth putting up with the crowds for the other things that they get. Okay? But if you don't agree, you don't have to live in a crowded place. And you know, the crowds are worth something. They bring all that diversity and those ideas and those chances for love that I talked about. I'm sure that the streets in Dallas sometimes get unpleasantly crowded. But I am also sure that if it weren't for the crowds, Dallas would be Oklahoma. So I'm not going to put crowding on my chart at all. What does go in my spillover costs? Well, here are some things that go there. Thievery, war, major pollution. Okay? If you have a kid who becomes a thief, if you have a kid who makes war on other people, if you have a kid who becomes a major polluter, you have done a real disservice to a lot of other people. Those are real. On the other hand, I would stop to take note that most people do not become serious thieves. Most people shoplifted a little when they were 8 maybe, but most people don't become serious thieves. Most people don't become warriors. Most people don't become major polluters. Some of those who do really cause huge problems. But by contrast, everybody has ideas that other people steal. Right? Everybody has ideas that other people steal. So my guess, when you weigh all this up, is that the spillover benefits are much bigger than the spillover costs, and that therefore the world does not have enough people. I'm going to come back to that. And I want to emphasize that's a guess. I haven't measured any of this stuff. But before I do that, let me just sort of make a little more graphical what the point is here. Imagine 2 families living on 2 plots of land, identical plots of land, and the one family doubles its size every generation. The other family practices 0 population growth. So that next generation, this has been divided into 2 half-size plots of land. The other family still has that. And the next generation, it gets divided again and divided again. The people over here, well, the people over there, they got a lot of land. That's pretty cool. The people over here have a lot of grandchildren. That's pretty cool too. They made their choices. Some people would rather have more land. Some people would rather have more grandchildren. That is not a social problem. That is an opportunity to celebrate diversity. That's an opportunity to say different people want different things and they've made different choices. Now, and moreover, the people over here have a lot of reasons to be glad for all those people over there, because there are a lot more potential friends and a lot more potential lovers and a lot more potential customers and a lot more potential employers and a lot more potential of anything you would, any interaction you would want to have with another person. On the other hand, if these people over here say, well, we don't have much land and they have a whole lot, let's go take it, then you got a problem. Then you've got a reason why you might wish that these people had fewer children. So insofar as these people interact across the families, there are some reasons to wish they'd had more children. There are some reasons to wish they had had fewer. I had 1 child, which seemed to us like the right number for us, given our preferences and given the life we wanted to live and so on. It's a girl. And we did not have a second child because we weighed the costs and the benefits, and we decided that was not for us. But somewhere in the world, maybe right here at SMU, there is a young lady whose life has been permanently impoverished by my failure to have the son who would someday sweep her off her feet. And if I had cared as much about that total stranger as I cared about my own daughter, I would have gone ahead and had another child. That's my daughter right there. I threw that in to prove we're related. People, I think that there is a human tendency, not just with population, but with all things, to notice costs more than you notice benefits, and that's a mistake. When you're stuck in traffic on a hot summer night, It's easy to remember that the guy in front of you, it would be better if he weren't there. It would be better if he hadn't been born, okay? But it's easy to forget that you're awfully glad for the birth of the guy who invented car air conditioning. And if we're going to cut back on the size of the population, you're equally likely to lose either of those. It's easy to remember that the person in front of you in the supermarket line is imposing a cost, but to forget that the stranger who helps you change a flat tire on a snowy night, well, maybe you don't get that many snowy nights in Dallas, but the stranger who helps you when you're in a tough situation is conferring a benefit. I do not know whether the world has too many or too few people. I'm pretty sure it has too few. I'm pretty sure it has too few because of this. I could be wrong. The costs of that thievery and war might be higher than I'm estimating. But here's what I'm absolutely sure of. What I'm absolutely sure of is that if you want to know whether the world is over or underpopulated, this is the only productive way to think about the question. The only productive way to think about any question of whether the world has too much or too little of something is to ask, what incentives were the decision makers facing, and how did those incentives affect their decisions? And then to say, okay, anything that they felt, any benefits and costs they felt, I can safely ignore because I know they weighed those against each other, and I only have to look at the spillovers. And then if you want a really accurate answer to this question, then you have to do the hard work of estimating those, the size of those spillovers better than I have. In the end, though, it seems to me that a world with more people is a world with more trading partners, more friendship, more love, more diversity, more ideas, and therefore more prosperity. And that's the kind of world that I think we should leave to our children. So I'll stop there.
I just interested in your comments on, I noticed that the incredible increase in standard of living that we've experienced since 1800 corresponds pretty well to the hydrocarbon age, you know, with coal being developed in 1800, first oil well 1860, railroads, electrification, et cetera. And just interested in your thoughts on that correlation as well.
I'm not sure I have any really insightful thoughts on that. There is a question of why growth took off when it did. That's one of the biggest questions, I think, that one of the great mysteries of history is why growth took off exactly when and where it did. There are certainly historians who believe that it had a lot to do with the population reaching a critical mass where there are a critical mass where technology took off, and then, as I talked about, each idea made the next idea a little easier to come by. At the same time, as technology progressed, it suddenly became a good, it became profitable to educate your children. Education was largely a luxury prior to that. You could educate your children and you weren't going to get back much return on your investment. But once the Industrial Revolution had happened and there were more technical occupations available and a lot of invention going on, suddenly an education was valuable, and so people got educated, and that led to more ideas and more progress. I'm not answering your question yet, but I have spoken to at least one historian who is convinced that we owe the entire Industrial Revolution and the whole takeoff of growth to the spread of just one key idea, and that key idea was that no matter what you do all week, it's worth taking off a couple hours once a week or so to think about how to do it better. And that idea, according to this historian I spoke to, was brand new around the year 1800, and that's the idea that made all the difference. How I'm going to relate all that to hydrocarbons, I mean, obviously, you're building new technologies, and those technologies, the first technologies that people came up with were pretty carbon heavy. Now, people are devoting a lot of time and energy to finding ways to mitigate those carbon emissions. And so I would expect that, as with anything else, and certainly the air in most American cities is a lot cleaner now than it was 30 years ago, a lot cleaner. And a lot cleaner because of people having ideas and devoting themselves to figuring out. So I think it's a temporary thing, that it was tied to the particular kind of technology that we started with. And as we move on to new kinds of technologies, some of them are not so demanding on carbon in the first place, and others are technologies specifically designed to clean up problems with carbon. My gut feeling is that this is a historical accident that is not important in the long run, but I could be completely wrong about that. Yeah.
First of all, I want to thank you, because I thought your presentation was phenomenal.
Well, thank you.
Optimistic and very, very hopeful. Okay, so now my question. I've got two parts. My first question is, because you say that, people, that more people can be better, and I completely agree with you. What's your position on borders? That's my first question. So basically on immigration, and do you support border constraints, which is it's a hard question, but I'm interested in your intellectual perspective, because I know there are a few people here that are very open border. My second is on ideas, and this does not relate to your topic of population. But in today's environment, when we hear about efforts to suppress the exchange of ideas, including government and technology working together to suppress ideas being promoted. And I know back in the world, we've had this forever, and we've had the progress you've shown. What's your perspective going forward when we do know that we face this new challenge?
Well, okay, I'll take both of those. First of all, borders. My strong instinct is I would like to see as little border control as we can possibly get away with, consistent with basic security issues. And there are a number of reasons for that. And one is that, and it's very much tied to the population thing, if you bring more people into the country, people in this country are going to benefit from that. They're going to be potential employees, potential customers, potential employers eventually. The ability to interact with other people is a good thing. And there is no question that bringing in more immigrants will increase the income of the average American. Now, that won't be spread completely equally, but I think I can say that we know that if we have more immigration, Americans on average will get richer. That's an economic point. From a purely a more ideological point, I don't want the government telling me who I can invite into my living room. And if I got a friend in Venezuela and I want to invite him into my living room, I think I ought to be able to do that. And or if I want to hire somebody who currently lives in Mexico City, I don't want the government telling me who I can hire. So that's another reason why I would like to see those borders open. Now, I have to say this. I live in New York State, pretty far from the border, and you guys live a lot closer. And we've got this governor in Florida who has been taking recent migrants and sending them up to New York and other states like that. And a lot of people have said, oh, what a terrible publicity stunt. But it seems entirely reasonable to me, because the fact of the matter is that people like me who speak so blithely about open borders, I don't live in a neighborhood where I'm kind of overrun with people who don't have jobs and are looking for handouts. And And that's part of it, right? I mean, that's a price that we pay. I think it's a price worth paying. To a certain extent, you let in anybody who wants to come, you're going to have problems. And I think that's a price worth paying for a number of reasons, because it's going to make Americans more prosperous in the long run, because it's going to make Americans freer in the long run, because it gives us more people we can interact with, and because it's a good thing for those people who were dealt a really bad hand in life. But I also realize that it's pretty easy for me to say, those are problems worth dealing with, that's a price worth paying, when I'm not the one paying the price. And people who live a little closer to the border are the ones paying the price. So I think that should be thrust in my face. I think that should be thrust in the face of people like me. And so I think this thing of sending them north and letting Northerners see what it's like to have these people come in, I think it's entirely fair and entirely reasonable. And I don't think it's going to change my mind, but it is something I should be forced to think about. So that was on the immigration. And I'm sorry, I've forgotten what the other one was.
On ideas of...
Oh, suppressing ideas. I am certain that there are ideas that ought to be suppressed. I don't trust the government to figure out which ideas those are. Okay? And I don't know who else can suppress them. So although I think we would be better off if some of those ideas could be suppressed without any side effects. But I don't know any way to suppress those ideas without giving a lot of power to a lot of people who I think are probably not going to use it very wisely. So I
Can I
go ahead.
clarify my question?
Sure.
Sorry. My point wasn't that I support, because I think that the ideas should just be open. I was asking you, given what we're seeing now, where we know that you've got high tech and government working together to try to suppress ideas, will this have an impact, in your opinion? We don't know, because we've had terrible things in the past as well. Will this impact your perspective of the role of ideas going forward, because less ideas are going to come out?
Okay. So I can imagine a world in which this becomes such a big problem that people are not able to. I mean, there certainly are places around the world. If you live in North Korea and you have a great idea for how to revamp the economy, that idea has no value. So certainly we have seen that there are social situations and governmental situations, political situations, where good ideas lose all their value because they are suppressed. So yes, that absolutely could happen.
Okay, going back to your chart that you showed the income going up as the years went by. So like from...
I'll pull it back up.
Yeah, so right after the Great Depression in the 1930s, you see a huge increase in the average wage or average income.
Average income.
Average income.
And that's
There we
probably...
go. And so, that looks like it's World War II
That's
driven.
World War II.
But you would also say that could be driven by a baby boom. So you could say that the greater the increase in the population at a certain time would be, the greater the impact of the chart that you're showing, right? So because there was a large amount of population increase in the United States during those very years, baby boom.
But most of that new population were still infants at that time, so I don't think we can really...
They would say that it would have driven that. So I was just wondering if there was any other times that we would say, like, we saw large population increases or decreases where we would see that drive the chart.
The answer to that, I think, in this chart, I don't know. This only covers the last couple hundred years, and it only covers the United States. But if you look at the paper that I referenced by Michael Kremer, Kremer, again, Nobel Prize winner in economics, it's full of historical examples of exactly the sort that I think you're looking for. The title of the paper is, the words 1 million years are in the title. It's something like economic growth for the last million years or something like that. And you will find there many examples of, I think, exactly what you're looking for.
Okay.
At the start of your presentation, you started out with something about selfish behavior of people. And I'm wondering about any correlation you see with where we are now with the economy and the people, and how less than 1% of the people control the other 99% with plenty of left. You know, you got Elon Musk and everyone else like that owning more than the rest of the world combined. Any thoughts on that? Any correlation on how it's all evolved and where we're going?
I don't think it's important. Everybody's getting richer, and I think that's the main thing that matters. If you lived today the way the average American lived in the 1950s, you would be considered, officially, you would be way below the poverty line. A rising tide lifts all boats, and as we have gotten richer, I had a slide, which I deleted because I didn't want to spend too much time on it, but it showed increases in quality of life for the very poorest Americans over the last 200 years, and it's as dramatic as this. Most poor people, most of the people in America who we think of as the very poorest, have got washing machines, they got television sets. In climates like this, they tend to have air conditioning. They don't have roof leaks. Something like 80% of them say that they have no unmet medical needs. I wish I still had the slide here. If Elon Musk is getting real rich, and if that's part of the process that's letting these people get rich, I'm for it.
Thank you, Steve.